Okay, here we go. All right, so this morning we're going to talk about authentication. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take 2 minutes on your own to think about what authentication is, and try to describe in your own words authentication within the context of a Rails application or just a web application in general. So go ahead and we'll take till 9:05 to describe in your own words what is authentication. Okay, can I get a volunteer to describe what authentication is in their own words? Any takers? Jeremiah, what is authentication?
It's, I guess, a way for a user to prove that they are who they are or who they say they are.
Yeah, that's great. So a way for a user to prove that they are who say they are. Awesome. Cool. All right, Hope, I see your hand up as well. What's authentication?
And this is checked usually by comparing what they give you with the users table.
Yep. Love it. Perfect. So yeah, so it's usually verified by checking, if someone gives you credentials, you want to go see what's in your database and verify that those exist and that they are correct. Great. Any other thoughts on authentication? Okay, cool. So I think that was spot on. And the only thing I'll add is typically this is traditionally done with a username / email and password combination. And so I think we've all used applications pretty extensively at this point. And when we log in, it's usually like, hey, what's your email? What's your password? What's your username? What's your password? And that should match with when you registered to be a user, you set up those credentials. And so when you come back to the application, they're looking to see that you provide the credentials that you set up. So today we're going to walk through that process within a Rails application. And we're going to actually start off. I'm going to just walk through the process and show you my process for authentication. And then I'm going to give you time after that to implement it on your own. And, please feel free to ask questions along the way. And periodically we'll stop and come back and revisit some additional concepts like Bcrypt, which is a gem that we're going to use to encrypt passwords. And then we'll talk about sessions as well. Any questions before I get started? All right, I'm going to actually rearrange my screens here a little bit. Oh, sorry, Hope, I didn't see. Is that your hand for a new question or was that from the previous question?
It's a new one.
Okay.
But it was just, so authentication does also consider biometrics too, right?
I mean, it can, sure. If you have the technology to take that type of data. But yes, yeah, there's definitely different ways of authenticating that someone is who they say they are. Okay, let me get my Atom set up real fast. I'm going to move it to my big screen so that y'all can see it. And let me get my terminal set up. So if you're following along in the repo, I'm going to check out a branch called Authentication. And let me share this one more time. Okay. All right. Let me know if y'all can see my Atom and then my terminal. Okay, perfect. Okay, so here I'm going to check out a branch called Authentication, and that's where we're going to start adding our code. So the first place we're going to pick up on authentication is by registering a user. So this process should be pretty familiar from Mod 2. If I had to think through the steps, the first step obviously would be to create a test, but we are going to create a form that's going to allow someone to enter an email and a password, and then we're going to store that information on the users table. Okay, so that's the very first step for registering. So I'm going to grab.
You mind increasing your font size just a bit?
Yeah, for the terminal.
In both, quite a bit probably.
Okay, I can't increase the font size in the tree, but I will when we start adding new files. So first thing I'm going to do, and in this repo, I've got some preliminary setup. It's basically just a bare Rails application at this point. I'm going to go to my gem file and just checking, is that font size okay, or do you want that bigger, Jordan?
Maybe a wee bit bigger on the terminal, and then
Okay.
also as well as an Atom.
Okay.
Please,
Is
thank you.
that better?
That's better in Atom, yeah.
Okay.
And
how's
that's
that?
a little better. Perfect, thank you.
Okay, absolutely. All right, so I've got a few gems loaded already. And these are all just in our development test block. So I've got Capybara, I've got Pry, I've got our Spec Rails, Shoulda Matchers, and Launchy. And I just went ahead and did the setup for the tests already, and also for the Shoulda Matchers, so that we're ready to go. So I'm going to come over, I'm going to create a feature test. And I'm going to put that in a features folder, and I'm going to say like user can register spec. Okay. And then I'm going to require my Rails helper. And then I'm going to describe user registration form. Okay. And then I'll create a test that says creates a new user. All right. So what I'm going to do next is from our the first link in the calendar invite should be a intro to basic auth lesson. I'm going to be following along with that with a few deviations, but for the most part, following through that lesson plan. So I'm going to start with the first user story there. So I'm going to copy and paste that. And then I'm going to comment it out because just to have it as a guide for writing our test. So the user story reads, as a visitor, when I visit the root page or the root path, I click on a link that says sign up to be a user. I can enter registration details in a form and submit that form. Then I should see a welcome message with my username, and my user details have been saved in the database. So we're going to walk through that. So I'm going to do visit root path. And then I'm going to click link, and I'm just going to say register. Did I spell that right? As a user. All caps. And then I'm going to, I'm dream driving right now. I don't have the form yet, but I'm going to fill in an email field with, we'll say alex@example.com. And then I'm going to fill in a password field with password, because that's really secure. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to submit a form. So I'm going to say click button, register. And then I should then I see a welcome message. So I'm going to say expect page to have content. Welcome. And I'll just say alex@example.com. Okay. So that's the welcome message that I want to see. And at that point, I would expect that my information is saved to the database as well. All right, any questions on that before we start running? Okay, all right, I'm gonna run my test. And I like to run individual tests. So I'm gonna start there. Okay. Uh-oh. What do I see here? Hold on just a second. Let me just make that bigger. Uninitialized constant should, what's happening? Let me go look and make sure I have the configuration in my spec helper. I do.
Check your gem file.
Okay. I've got shoulda matchers there. I'll bundle one more time just to make sure I've got everything loaded, which I see it here.
It may need to be put in the Rails helper file instead.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. So I'm going to move that, see if that makes a difference. Let's try it. One more time. Please work. Yay, that was it. Perfect. Thank you all for help debugging that. Okay, cool. So the first thing we have is we don't have a root path. So, you may or may not have used that helper before, that path helper, but this is the exact same as this. So I'm just calling it root path because that's going to be kind of the root of our application. So we're going to go into our routes file. Let me get rid of this. And I'm going to say root. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to create a welcome controller with an index action. And that's kind of just like a standard, like a place to kind of start applications. So you'll see that. This is the same as doing this. Get /to welcome index. So these two are identical. I'm going to choose to do this option here because it's a little bit more explicit. So now when I go back and I run my test, let's see what we have. Okay, cool. So uninitialized constant welcome controller. I'm going to go over to the controller. I'm going to create that. Cool. Welcome. That inherits from application controller. Okay. And I'll keep going. I expect to see an index action not found. Perfect. I'm going to do that. And I'm going a little bit faster here because this should all be review from what y'all covered in mod 2. Cool. Okay, now we need a view. We're missing a template. Perfect. So I'll come over to my views and create a welcome folder and then an index HTML ERB. Okay, so now we're here. And according to our user story, we should have a form or sorry, a link that says register as a user. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to register. We'll use a link helper. And then we're going to do new user path here because I'm creating a new user and I register a user. Any questions about that? Does that all make sense so far? Okay. All right. Cool. So undefined variable or method, new user path. Cool. I'm going to go to my routes and I'm going to add resources, users, and then I only want to do new at this point. I'll check my routes to make sure that that generates what I think it should. And here I have new user, and that's the new user path. That's our prefix. And then it goes to our users controller with a new action. And so I'm going to run the test again, see what I get. Cool. Uninitialized controller, users controller, go back to our controller, and we're going to create that. Okay. And in here, it's from application controller. Cool. I expect to see a action new not found error. Perfect. There it is. Okay. I'm going to go here and I expect to see that I don't have a view. Perfect. Now we're going to go create the view. And now I'm going to create a user's new view. Okay. And here is where I'm going to have my form. So if I were to go run the test again, I would expect to see an error that says I can't find the fields of the form. And there it is. So we're going to create that form. I'm going to use form with, and I'm going to bind it to a model. So I'm going to bind it to my user model. And I need to actually tell it it's a model. And then I'm going to do local true just to make sure our form is correct. It works correctly and renders correctly. And then here I'm going to add a label. So I'm going to say f.label, and that's going to be email. And then I'm just going to add a little label there. And then next I'm going to do f.text field, and that's going to be email. And then I'm going to just copy the same thing. I'll do a label for password. And then I'll do a text field for password as well. And then the last thing I need to do is create a button. So form.submit, and that was called register. Cool. And let me just go back and check our test to make sure I have that correct. Email, password, and register. Great. So going back to our here, I think that's everything I need. Then I'm going to run the test. Cool. And so now I don't have a route to submit the form because since we bound it to the user model, it automatically is going to look for a route that is /users/new, or sorry, it should be post/users. So that this area is a little bit misleading, but we're just going to go with it. So I'm going to create a route, and I'm going to add our create here to get our post route to submit the form. And I expect to see some other errors because I haven't set up the form correctly. So because I know I'm binding the form, I know that I'm going to need to pass it a new user object. So I'm just going to do this here so that the form knows that it's a new form, it's an empty object, and then it's going to want to post to the object. So hopefully this will get rid of that misleading error. Okay, cool. So it did. And now we have this error that says uninitialized constant users controller user. So in the users controller, we're calling user, and it doesn't know what that is because we haven't set up our database yet, and we don't have a user model at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over, we're going to TDD, and I'm going to TDD on the model side now. So I'm going to create some model tests. Models, and then it's going to be user spec.rb. Cool. So we'll require the Rails helper here, and then describe. How do I want to do this? Sometimes I like to do like an rspec describe for my model tests, but it actually doesn't matter. I'll just do this. Describe user model do, and then I'll do describe. I'm going to start out with some validations. And I'm going to be using shoulda matchers, so they'll be straightforward validations. So I'm going to validate the presence of my email. I'm also going to validate the uniqueness of the email, and then I'm going to validate the presence of the password here. So it should validate presence of email. And let me do my spacing. And then I have a uniqueness validation here. Uniqueness of email. And then I want to validate the presence of the password. Cool. Okay. And actually, I am going to change this specifically to be for the user model. And tell it like what type of test it is, just so it knows it's like looking for the user specifically. And then I'm going to run this test. So now we're in Spec, models, user spec. Okay, so I'm just probably going to get a variety of errors. Probably the same one of uninitialized constant user. Perfect. So that's going to lead us to what should we do next? What do you think the next step is? Hope.
Well, that password isn't very secure.
Yes, you are correct. Ben, what do you think the next step is?
I think it wants us to create a user model.
Yes, that's correct. So I'm going to use a generator. I'm just going to do Railsdb model user, and then I'm going to give an email string and I have no commas, and then password, which I'm also going to create as a string. Okay. And here I'm actually not going to create a password field or a column on the database. I'm actually going to create a password digest column. Dun, dun, dun. Here's where we deviate from our our normal Rails flow. And this is because we're going to be using this Bcrypt gem, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So I'm going to create an email and password digest. And I'm using a generator to create a model. And that model is actually going to create a migration as well. Have y'all used that generator for models and migrations? Okay, cool. So I'm going to do this. And it's going to generate, it's probably going to generate a new test that I need to delete, which it did. There's a conflict in my models, which is fine. It kept my test, which is great. And then, so I need to, it's saying, do I want to overwrite it? And I'm going to say no. Okay. So it skips my test since I already have the test. And then what it did as well is it created a migration here. And then it created the model for us, the user model. So we got 3 things for the price of 1. So I'm going to come over to my migration first, and I'm always going to check my migrations before I run them. This is like something you should do. Make sure everything looks good. We've got a user table we're creating, and then email and password digest, which is great. And now I'm going to do Railsdb Migrate here. Okay, and it's because I already have a table, so I need to drop it. I'm just going to do a reset here, and it's going to drop my table. It's going to create it, and it's going to run the migration. So I already, yeah, oh, sorry, it didn't run the migration. It just dropped it and created that. So now I can run my migration. You won't run into this error if this is the first time you're doing it. All right, cool. So we did our migration. And now when we go look at our schema, we'll see that we have a users table with an email and a password digest column. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come back and we're going to run our test again here. And now I expect to see some errors because I don't have any validations. Okay, cool. So it should be validating the presence of an email, but it's not. Same thing with uniqueness and same thing with password. So we're going to go to our user model and we're going to add some validations in here. And so we will first validate our email. Oops. So validates email. And then we want to do both uniqueness, true. And you can do this on one line. You can do presence, true. And then we want to validate password, presence, true. Okay. So there's our validations. When we run the tests, I'm hoping that these will pass. Okay, and it didn't. Oh, here we go. So we're saying, hey, you're validating the presence of a password, but yet you have a password digest field in your database. So here's where Bcrypt comes in. So I'm going to take a break and we're going to take a palm. So we'll come back and then we'll talk about Bcrypt and then we'll continue on with our test. So let's come back at 9:37.
Do you mind if I look at that?
Before I forget. All right. So when we're implementing authentication, the worst thing that we could possibly do is store plain text passwords in our database. Okay. Why do you think that is? Any takers? Yeah. Doug. I'm gonna also just kind of call on people as well. Why do you think we don't want to store plain text passwords in our database?
Because in the case of a data breach, anybody who steals that information has all the passwords, and oftentimes people use the same password from multiple places. So while you may not really need that password too much, it could also be their bank account, their something else, and it could turn into a huge issue.
Yes, exactly. So moral of the story is don't store plain text passwords in your database. Cool. Awesome. And because you become a target for hackers. So in order not to do that, we want to actually store an encrypted password in our database so that if someone hacks our database, you know, all they're going to see is a bunch of gobbledygook, and they won't, theoretically, they'll have a harder time figuring out how to get to the real password. So we use a gem. We're going to use a gem called Bcrypt. And what Bcrypt does is it provides what we call a hashing algorithm for us. So Bcrypt provides a hashing algorithm. And the way that works is it'll take your data, and such as your passwords, and it will create a hash from that password. Or you could say it hashes the password. Okay, and so what that means is it creates an alphanumeric representation of the data, and it's also a unique, hopefully. There's a small chance that it could not be unique, but it's most likely a unique alphanumeric representation of the data, and it can also be thought of as a digital fingerprint. Okay. So it's going to take your password and it's going to create this unique hash for your password. And it's a one-way process. So once it hashes the password, it can't unhash it. And this is like the form of encryption. So it will store that in the, and it also, I think you can also call it a digest. So the hash password could also be thought of as a digest, which is why the password field is called password digest, that we're storing in our database and not the actual password itself. And so once it's hashed, we can't get back to the original password very easily. And it uses a few different things. And I've linked to the documentation for Bcrypt here. And if you scroll down to the bottom, there's a little how it works section that I think might be worthwhile to kind of read through as you're walking through this process. But basically it has a couple different strategies for creating a more secure digest or hash. And one of those is also with the addition of what we call a salt, which is like a small piece of random data that it adds to the beginning of the password. So that if someone were to come in and try to kind of brute force their way into guessing what that hash password, the original password is that created the hash password, they would have a really hard time doing that because now you've got some random information at the beginning of it as well. So they need to know both things. And there's some other security measures taken that are not exposed to us, obviously, so that someone couldn't figure out how this algorithm is working and unencrypt all of your information. So that was a really high level explanation, but in essence, we are going to encrypt our passwords. And I would encourage you to read through the documentation to understand a little bit more about how it's working. Any questions about that? Okay. All right.
I have one
oh.
question. When we're talking about, like, it's not like a data structure hash like we're used to. It's just kind of, it's a hash in encryption terms is more of just kind of like a string representation of some gobbledygook.
Yeah, so it is so when you think about hashing information, the hash that's created is like a set size. And so no matter how big or small your password is, it's going to create a hash that is like the same size. And as I mentioned, it's usually like an alphanumeric representation, so a combination of numbers and letters that's generated from the data. And I don't know, I think, Ian, can you speak to like maybe a little bit more of the detail about how that hash is created?
Yeah. So
Just high level.
yeah, I mean, at a super high level, hashes it's just a mathematical formula that it's processing the data over and over. And it's something that we call like a one-way encryption. It should literally take until our sun burns out to be able to take that hash and turn it back into plain text by undoing those steps. And so when we talk about hashing, we're talking about like kind of like a one-way street of like we're putting it through this algorithm, and there should never be a way to turn that back into plain text. And what we'll see a little bit later when we actually try to log in with Bcrypt, what we're doing is we're saying, take whatever password they give us in the login field, put that back through the same hashing algorithm, and then compare the hashed outputs and say, does this output exactly match what we have in the database? And if so, then they typed in the right password. And it takes like case sensitivity and all that stuff into account. And so hashing is really just, it's a math formula. And there are different kinds of hashing algorithms. And someone asked in chat earlier, like, does it use SHA-256? SHA is a different type of hashing algorithm, and it's meant to be extremely fast, but fast isn't good for passwords. We want that hash, like that mangling of that data, to be as slow as possible because we want it to like really mix and stir things up so that it's way harder to reverse. There was a hashing algorithm years ago called MD5, which was kind of the de facto standard for a long time. And then people started realizing like, you know what, it's actually not secure. It doesn't give unique values for different strings. And it was actually relatively fast to generate like every possible letter number combination in a lookup table for MD5 because it got to be so fast to run on modern hardware. So SHA is meant to be even more complex, but even given like the kinds of processors that we have and getting into quantum computing and stuff, that's actually going to get sort of obsolete at some point as well. And so Bcrypt is actually a much slower hashing algorithm because there's a lot more math involved under the hood. And it makes it much more secure for using passwords.
Awesome. Thanks, Ian. I see a question from Joseph.
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused as to, so like your password goes in, it randomly generates, it's attached to the salt, but if someone uses the same password word for word, or letter for letter, I should say, is it going to be the same kind of generation? And if not, how can you pull things out? Like, how can you go back? So when you enter your password to log into that site a second time, like, what is the connection? Like, how does it get back to that encrypted message.
So you're saying because it's got this like randomly generated part that goes into, like the hash that's created, how do we get back to that?
Yeah.
And so I think there is, you can think of it like setting up the random generator with the right, like in the right way so that it won't be random. It'll regenerate the same hash again. So I think it uses a salt, and then it uses also some other information that's stored in your Rails application, which is like kind of like this secret token that gets generated every time you create a new Rails app. It's actually like hidden within your application, and it's something you can get to, but you never want to expose, because if someone had that, in addition to, they hacked and they found your password digest in your database and they took the little salt, they could probably get back to your original password. So it's kind of random, but kind of not really random, because you can like reset the generator so that it's going to like generate the same password. And that's how it checks to make sure that your password is, is valid.
Okay.
So yeah. Cool. Jake, I see your hand as well.
Yeah, so I get the functionality of it, all that kind of good stuff. At the end of the day, how like Bcrypt encryption actually works from our perspective is that just kind of like the Rails magic that we don't actually have to worry about the nuts and bolts of how it's actually working. We just know how to use it and we're good.
Yeah, pretty much. I think it's good to have just like a brief, like high level overview of how it works, but you do not need to be concerned about the details.
So spending
and
like
that's
10 hours trying to figure it out is a waste of time.
Don't do that. No.
Okay.
That's not a good idea at this point. I would say that, that's kind of why we're using a gem. We're kind of outsourcing that functionality to someone else who's really spent the time to focus on that, so that we can utilize that service.
So at that point, then we should just kind of like trust that the community knows that this gem is not like a malicious actor who's stealing passwords at some point.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
For sure. And it's always when you use gems. Oh, go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, sorry. The interesting thing about that question is the Bcrypt gem is open source, but it's just math at the end of the day. And so even though it's open source and people can go in and see what the math formula is doing, there's still no way to reverse it. So like Alex said, like even if they get your secret token and they know your salt, it's not like they can decrypt the password. All they can do is keep generating new passwords, run it through the same sort of salt and secret token to see if it happens to match what's in the database. But there's still no way to reverse that thing back to plain text in reverse, because it's a one-way, like think about like a one-way street. It can only go that direction. There's no way for them to ever decrypt it, at least not until like massive quantum computing, kinds of CPUs are going to be on the market. And that's like probably decades down the road. So for now, it's as secure as we can make it.
Cool. Hey, Joseph, I see you had your hand up again. Did you? Oh, that was from before? Okay, cool. All right. So we're going to use Bcrypt. And this is something that actually ships now with Rails. And so we actually have it in our gem file already. The only thing we need to do is uncomment it out. But I would definitely take a look at the documentation for this gem as well, just so you can familiarize yourself with it. So we're going to jump back over to the code, and we are going to go to our gem file, and we're going to uncomment out the Bcrypt gem. So you'll see it here. And it basically, we have what's available to us called has secure password. And this is, I believe, just like an active model method that does a couple things for us. So inside of, let me bundle just to make sure we actually load that gem. Cool. All right, so now moving back to the model. go to our user model. What we're going to do is we're going to add has secure password. And this is what's going to make the connection between, hey, like the user is going to give us a password. And then at this point, like once they enter the password in the form, before we create the user object, Bcrypt is going to run and it's going to hash that password and it's going to store it in the database in that password digest column. The other thing that Bcrypt does for us that I'm not going to demonstrate today, but that you can definitely include in your projects if you'd like, is it allows for you to also provide a password confirmation field when you're like registering a user. And it'll ensure that the password field matches the password confirmation field as well. And you kind of get that functionality for free when you have using Bcrypt and this has secure password. So I'm going to add this to my user model. And now I'm going to run the test again. And if you remember before when we were running the test, we were getting undefined method password. Do you mean password digest? So hopefully that goes away. If we've done everything correctly. Cool. And now all of our tests pass. So great. The next step then is to move on to go back to our feature tests and continue on with that. So cool. Now we're getting an error in our form, and it's saying the email field isn't found. And so I'm going to go back and look at our form. And if we remember, we used form with and we bound it to our user model. So that's going to actually name our fields a certain way. And it's going to prepend all of our field names with, and so it's actually this, with user underscore and then whatever name we gave it. So that's why we can't find it. We can see that if we go into our, let me move all my Zoom pop-up things. If we go back to our spec and we use launching, we can do save and open page. Sorry, my dog. Okay. Save and open page. Let's see. We should be able to see in the browser what our HTML that's generated looks like. And let me just, I don't know where that window went. Hold on, let me find it. It's over here, all these windows. You'll see here for our, oh, so it does put it puts it on the label. So user underscore email, and then it also puts it on the ID for the input field, which is user underscore email. So we need to go back and change our test to reflect that here. So I'm going to say fill in user email and user password. And that's again because we use form with and we bound it to a model. So now I'm going to run my test. And take out that save and open page. And the error that we get is the action create could not be found, which is right. We just created the route and not the action. So let me remove that from my test. And we'll go and we'll do the create action in our user model, not our model, our controller, our user controller. Okay. Here, and now I think it's going to expect in our test to be to see this content. However, we're not doing anything once we get to the create action. So here's where we're going to have to create our user. So we could do something like this. Params. And I'm going to create some strong params here as, you know, an additional security feature so that no matter what people try to get into the form, I'm only going to allow certain information through. So I'm going to say user params, and I'm going to remember with form with params.require, it prepends our params with user. And I'm going to permit the email, and I'm going to permit the password fields through. Okay. And then I should be able to do that. And here we can see, if we want to see that real fast, what that looks like. You'll see here, try to make that a little bit bigger, that now we've got user, and the key, or sorry, the value is another hash that has email and password. So we have to do user and then grab the email and password from that. Okay. So we've got our strong params now, and we want to create a user. What else do we want to do? Let's go back to our user story. We want to expect the page to have the content welcome and then the email. And I think we wanted to see this a welcome message. Let's put this welcome message in a flash message. So after we create the user, we will go back. We will we probably want to redirect to the root page. And before we do that, we want to create a flash message. And it'll say welcome, and then user.email. And I think it had an exclamation mark. Okay, what do y'all think about this? Does that seem pretty good? Okay, I will assume that that is good. Okay, now one thing here, we don't actually have flash messages set up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create that in my application.html.erb here. And I'm going to just reference the lesson plan just to get that in there pretty quickly. So it's, again, we're iterating through all of our flash messages, and then we're going to display them, and we're also going to give them a class depending on the type of message that it is. So when I come back to my test, I'm hoping that this is enough to get it passing. Cool, and it passed. All right. So there we have it. We have the user registration flow. And something just to note, it's always good, and this is in the lesson plan. I'm not going to do this right now, but whenever you're taking in user information, especially information that's sensitive, like an email, password, that sort of thing, it's always good to what I would call sanitize that data. And so regardless of how they enter it in, like if they use a combination of uppercase and lowercase letters, if they do all lowercase, all uppercase, you probably want to store it consistently in your database. So you'd probably want to do something like, you'd probably want to downcase all of the information that you're getting in your form so that you can store it consistently in that database. And then when you retrieve it from the database, you want to retrieve the downcase version of that. Ben, I see your hand up.
Yeah. Is there a benefit to using just the user straight up the user.create rather than doing like the user.new and then having the flow logic for if it sends a rollback to the database, like it didn't get saved correctly, or should we just kind of now just be using the .create?
Are you saying here, like if it saves, then so you're saying like build out like kind of a happy and sad path.
Right.
Yeah. I think there's always a benefit to
Okay.
that because you're relying on user input, and users have this great way of using your application in ways that you never imagined could be used. And so you want to really try to account for that, and make sure that you're kind of, providing the guardrails for like, hey, this is how we want the application to be utilized. We don't want to end up with, anything weird or kind of wild in our database. So yeah, it's always a good idea. I'm not going to do that right now, but when you are, in your projects, like always do happy, sad path, any edge case testing that you can think of as well. Okay, so the next thing, and I'm moving a little bit quickly because we have a lot to get through. The next thing that we want to do is, now that we have a user that's registered and saved to our database, we want to then log in that user. And so this is the idea that, hey, I've registered already, I'm returning to the application, and I want to be able to log in using the credentials I provided during my registration, and then see all of the information that I have saved within the application. So we're going to pull in a new user story here. And before we move on to the next user story, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to take one more POM. We're going to come back at 10:10 and then we'll keep going. Okay. All right, so we're gonna move on to logging in. And real fast, I want to revisit something I saw in the chat. Ian, thanks for catching that. I think I said you should downcase the username and password, and like don't touch the passwords. Leave the passwords as is, but you should downcase the username. So thanks for catching that. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab the next user story about logging in, and we're going to create another feature test. And so I'm going to call this user login spec. So I'll require the Rails helper. And let me just make sure. Okay, good. I did unpause the recording. Okay, so we're going to describe. We'll call this user or logging in. User can log in. And this is with valid credentials. Okay, so we're going to do the happy path first. And we are going to just have this in here for reference. Okay, and so this story reads, as a registered user, when I visit the root path and I click on a link that says I already have an account, then I should see a login form. When I enter my username and password, and we're using an email instead, and submit the form, I am redirected to the home page, and I see the welcome message with my username. And then I should no longer see the link that says I already have an account. I should no longer see the link that says register as a user. And I should see a link that says log out. So this is the point where we're going to think about how do we actually implement this idea of logging in and keeping track of who our users are. So I'm going to go ahead and write this out. So I'm going to visit the root path. And then I'm going to click on a link that says I already have an account. And then I should see a login form. So I'm going to check my current path. So we're going to call this login path. And then I'm going to enter my email and my password. So fill in email with, and here I'm actually going to need to create a user here at my test, the beginning of my test, with an email, and I'll just use alex@email.com, and then my password is going to be real secure again. I'm just going to call it password. And now I'm going to fill in my form with user.email. Ooh, that's not what I want. And then I'm going to fill in the password with password. And again, once I create the user, this idea of like being able to get the password goes away because it's stored as password digest. So I gotta just tell it what the password is. And then I'm going to submit the form. And it'll say login. We'll say that button. And then I'm going to check that my current path. And now we should be back to our root path. And then I should see, oh geez, typing. So have content, welcome, I need double quotes, Baxter, stop. Okay, welcome, user.email. And then I should expect our page to not have content. And I'm going to say have links specifically. I already have an account. Okay. And then I'm going to expect that our page does not give me the option to register as a user because I already am logged in. And then finally, I'm going to expect that the page does have a button or a link to log out.
Alex, when you get a sec, can you turn on transcription, please?
Oh, yes, I can. Thanks, Ian. Let me do that now. Enable auto transcription. Okay. All right. Did I do that correctly, Ian? Can you double check for me?
Yeah, we're good. We're good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the reminder. Okay. All right. So I've got this test. And so I'm going to a login form. So actually I'm going to the root page. I'm clicking, I already have an account. It takes me to a login form. I fill in my email and my password. I click login. Then I get routed back to the root path and I see welcome, our flash message. And then I expect not to see I already have an account or register as a user because at that point I should be logged in. And then I also want to see a button that says log out. So I'm going to comment out some of this just to get the first part of it going, but then we'll come back in and continue with the test after I get all of this passing. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to start by running the test. And now we're in our user can log in spec. And I think I just called it user login spec. Okay, so I'm going to run this test. And I have some errors. So I'm going to go fix that. I'm missing a comma or a colon here. I'm going to run this again. Okay. Okay, root path is not available because I have it in a describe block and I need to actually make this an it. All right. Now we should be ready to rock and roll. Here we go. We're running the test. Okay, awesome. Unable to find a link. I already have an account. So let's go create that because we have not created that yet. So we are going to go to our welcome index page, our roots page. Okay. And we're going to create a new link, and that's going to say, I already have an account. And yeah, it's lowercase. And this is going to take us to our login path. So when I make this change and I run the test again, I'm going to expect that it's going to throw me an error that says you don't have a login path. So let's see if I'm right. Okay, cool. So we got that error login path here. So we're going to go to our routes. And I'm going to create that. So this is going to be a non-RESTful route because if you think about like a login, it's not necessarily a resource. And so I'm going to just do a get to /login. And then I'm going to send that to for now, I'm going to put it in our users controller. So I'm going to make a non-standard Rails action called users, and I'll just call it login form. So now that I have that route, I'm going to run the test again, and it's going to tell me I don't have that action. Yep. So I'm going to go create that action. And just heads up, like we are going to refactor this to try to be a little bit more RESTful once we start talking about sessions. So I'm going to do it now in a non-RESTful way, and then we're going to refactor it to try to make it slightly more RESTful. It's still probably not super RESTful. Okay, so in my users controller, I'm going to create that login form action. And then I'm going to run the test. And I think it's going to tell me I need a view. Cool, so I've got that. I'm going to come over and I'm going to, in my users folder, create a login form view. Okay. Here we're going to add a form. So I'm going to use form with again. And if I were to run the test, I think it would tell me I can't find the fields. I'll just run the test so I'm not skipping any error messages. So I can't find email. Great. We're going to create a form. I wanted that. So I'm going to say form with, and this time, instead of binding my form to a model, to a user's model, I'm just going to add in the URL, which is going to be /login, or sorry, we have path helpers. We don't even need to do that. So it's going to say login path. And then my method is going to be a post because I'm going to submit this form. I'm creating a login. So I want to post this form. Local true, do, and then form. Okay, we'll get our end there. And then I'm going to create this form and give it a label. And this is going to be email. Email. And this is going to be a text field. Okay. And then I'm going to do the same thing for password. Cool. And then I'm going to change this as well. And then I'm going to create my submit button. And I think we said that was going to be login. Okay.
All right. Also, on line 5 of your view, you probably don't want that to be a text field. Otherwise, people will be able to see what the password is as they type it in.
Ooh, good catch. You're right. So if we want, so the browser is going to give us some functionality that will help with security. And that's when you're typing in, you'll see it'll be obfuscated. So you'll see the little dots instead of like just the plain text password. So good catch on that. I think you could also do some things with the email field as well, where the browser will do some validations for you as you're typing the email to say, hey, does this actually look like an email address? And if not, it won't let you submit the form. So a couple of different things to play around with in terms of forms, but we'll keep it simple for now. So I'm going to run the test again. I expect it's going to yell at me about the path for this form, and it's just going to yell at me about syntax. All right, let's see what I did. I think I don't need that trailing comma, so I'm going to run my test again. Okay, cool. So now I get the no route post for login. So let's go back to our routes. So we have basically could be considered kind of like a new action where you get a new form. And now we need that create action for our login. So we're gonna do login. Oops, sorry, it should be a post, not a get. Post login to, and we're gonna say users, and then I'm just gonna call this login because it's the actual logging in. Cool, so when I run the test, I expect it's gonna yell at me about not having the action, and it does. So I go into my users controller, which is right here. And then I will create the login action. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, now it's in our test, we're expecting to be rerouted back to the root path, and we're not. We're still on the login path. And so here is where we have to add some functionality into our login action. Okay, so when we think about logging in a user, what are the steps that need to happen? So someone has provided their username and password in a form, and that gets sent as params to the controller. Joseph, what do you think?
We should find them.
Okay.
I would think, yeah, so we would find them by the email.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah, we could do like @user equals user dot find by email, and then params email. Yeah.
Okay, like that. Perfect. Awesome. Okay, what do we think our next step is? And I saw, was it Kyle? Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, then I think we would want to, if the user exists, then we would want to compare the user's hash password with the one that they provided us.
Yes, yes, I think that is a great next step. So one thing to note is if you never did that and you just found the user by the email and then, like provided a flash message and redirected, you're not actually verifying that the user is who they say they are. And this test would pass. And so it's really important. And let's just do that because then we can go in and add a sad path test to make sure that it's actually working. But yes, Kyle, that would be the next step is we need to somehow authenticate the user. So I'm gonna just add this in here for now. We'll get back to that step. And I'll say flash message equals welcome user.email, and then we want to redirect to the root path. Okay, and yeah, and as Ian mentioned, this idea of kind of sanitizing our data, this would be the second place where the email, it would be downcased as long as here when we're taking the email from the form, and I'll just go ahead and put that in there. We could do something like this. I don't think I can use dot notation. Okay, So this would be like how we sanitize this to make sure that our email is downcased before we save it. And then when they log in, when we look them up by the email, we need to look them up by the downcased email. And again, like some of this should probably live outside of the controller, like maybe in the model. But this is what it would look like. So we're gonna run this test, and hopefully I did everything correctly. That's not it. Let me make sure I'm here. And it passes, like we said, but we're not actually authenticating the user. So now we're gonna go back to our test and we're gonna do a sad path test here. And I think Ben brought up the question of like, is it worthwhile to do happy and sad paths? And yes, it is, because you can have passing tests and you can actually not have the correct functionality. So back to our user, and I'm gonna close out some of the things we don't really need. Back to our user login spec. And we'll come back to the end of this. We're gonna add another test, and this is the sad path. And so this is user can log in with valid credentials, and it, I always struggle with naming my tests in a way that lets them be like readable. I'll just change this to logging in with valid, and this is with invalid credentials. Okay. So here, we're going to pretty much copy the same thing, only we are going to modify a few parts of it. So same flow, if I click on, I already have an account, I go to the login path and I see the form, but now I'm going to put in a password that's not my password. And then I'm going to click login. And I expect that we're not rerouted, but I expect the current path to still be the login path. And then I also want to see a message telling me maybe something like username, or sorry, email or password is incorrect. And I'm staying intentionally ambiguous about the messages that I'm sending back to the user in case it's a bad actor and they're trying to figure out which one of these doesn't work. I don't want to let them know which one it was. So I'm going to run my test now, and I'm going to run just this individual test so we can get our sad path going. So here we're going to do this. Oh yeah, I need to look at the line number 30, so I can just run that test. Okay, so now we're going through everything okay, and then we get to the point where we're in our controller and we're not being, we are being redirected to our root path, and so we need to go change that and add some things. So user.findBy. So if we find the user, here's where we want to authenticate whether or not their password is correct. So I'm going to add an if statement, and I'm going to say if user exists, then I'm going to, this is this happy path, and then this is the sad path. And so for the sad path, I want to give a flash message that says username or password is incorrect. Or as Ian mentioned in the chat, you know, some type of message to shame them for not providing the right information. I'll think I'll be a little
all
bit
about shaming the user.
yeah, it's great. That's how you design great UX. Just shame them all over the place. Okay, so we want to re-render our login form. And so I think I want to do this. If we don't, if if we're in the sad path and we don't authenticate their password, we want to give them a flash message. And then I think I made this lowercase. We also want to re-render the form. So here is where we are going to figure out how to authenticate the user. And lucky for us, Bcrypt gives us this authenticate method that will allow us to check. It will take the input from the form, it'll hash it, and it'll match the hashed passwords to see if they match. So if user, and it goes like this, authenticate, and we're going to pass it the params of the password. And if this comes back as true, then we're going to get a flash message and we're going to redirect to the root path. Else, if it's false, then we're going to say, give them the error message and then re-render the form. Any questions about that? Ben.
It's more of just kind of the general, when you're pushing all this stuff up, is it automatically like the stuff for Bcrypt added to the git ignore so you don't push your stuff up to your repo, or are there any other steps we need to take to make sure we don't expose any important things?
Yeah, so since it is a gem, it is automatically like that source code is not exposed, or you should not be able to see that on GitHub. So you're fine. You don't need to do anything else to ignore any of the data or any of the code. Okay, so I'm going to run my test again and see where we're at. Okay. Okay, I put username or password is incorrect. And it should be email. And we're going to run our test and hopefully this will pass it. Perfect. Now I'm going to run my entire test to make sure that our happy and sad path work, and they do. So this is our user logging in. Any questions about that flow? I'll let it sink in. It is like quite the procedure, I would say. So like you just need to think kind of top down of what you're trying to do. As in like registering a user, you create a form and then you kind of go through that flow of submitting the form, of actually creating the record in the database and redirecting the user. And it's the same thing with login. You provide a form, they enter their credentials, you go through the process of authenticating the credentials is what we're doing here. And then you give them feedback and you redirect them. So that's kind of the basic flow there. Kyle, question.
So if a user isn't found on line 20, would the app throw an error for can't call like invalid method on nil class if user is nil?
Let's see. I'm going to just not downcase it and see what happens. And we'll see the error that we get. It looks like it, well, it doesn't matter because let me change my test. So we'll actually get an error. Okay. So when I create it, I'm going to say Alex, but here I'm going to just pass it the string. Okay. Or I'm not even going to worry just on downcasing. I'll just give it a totally different email. Oh, geez. Okay. And then when we come back to our controller, I'm just going to keep the downcasing just so this is a more clear path to an error. We'll run the test and see what happens. Okay, yeah, so it's undefined method authenticate for nil class. So yeah, so we would want to try and do some error handling. So you could do something like if user and user.authenticate, something like that. I think that would throw us to our sad path. Let me just run the first test. Oh, I did the invalid credentials. Let me change that back and do the other test and then run it here. Okay. All right, and I'm gonna run just the tests on line 4. Okay, so now we should be hitting, this should be this happy path, but we're gonna hit the sad path. So it's gonna stay on the login form, and it's going to render this message. And I can also do that, you know, in our development environment if you want to see that, or does that kind of make sense, Kyle?
That makes sense.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so definitely I think that's like, you know, an edge case or some error handling that you want to account for. Ian, did you have question, comment?
Yeah, so on not so much a question, just an extra comment from a security standpoint. One other thing that's pretty interesting here is some malicious actors, or what we call bad actors, will actually run timing on your app, because the user lookup that we're doing on line 19 is going to be fairly fast. But then if we also have to do that really slow hashing algorithm on line 20 in order to figure out if the password is bad, that's going to slow down how long it takes to get the message that says your credentials are bad. And so what some bad actors will do is they'll actually time how long does it take to get that error message back. And if it comes back really fast, then that means they can determine that it was the email that was bad. But if it takes longer to get that message back, then that means the email was right, but the password was bad because they actually had to like go authenticate the password. So there are still like ways that they can determine whether it was the email or the password that was bad in this case. It's important when we're writing these apps to sometimes think about like what would those, you know, malicious people be thinking about trying to do. And so there's lots of very interesting things like this that you can sort of think about. And, you know, as developers, we might put in like random sleep timers in here of like, you know, if the user wasn't looked up, maybe throw in like a few microseconds of a sleep or something like that, just to kind of mimic how long it might have taken to authenticate the password anyway. Just little things like that, just to try to throw off bad actors. But yeah, just wanted to add that in as an extra comment. Also, I think in your happy path test, Alex, I think you were still passing in the bad email address in your happy path test.
Yeah, I wanted to do that just to show that it catches
Gotcha.
the error that we wanted to see there with the user. Yeah, I will change that. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions, Kyle? Did you have your hand up? Oh, you do.
Yeah, I had one more question. In the controller.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was we're passing in the params email.down case. Would we want to try to use strong params for that, so that like to prevent from like some sort of SQL injection or like bad inputs? Or does it matter?
So I think in general, strong params are a good idea. Here we get into a little bit of a, I guess I could create a, I don't know how I feel about that. Ian, feel free to comment if you think this feels weird, but we get into a little bit of an issue. We can't use the same method here because we're using form with and we're binding our, you know, the information we get from our registration form to the model, to the user model. And so it's going to prepend our email with the user, but here in our login form, we're not binding that to a model. And so it's not going to prepend user to our email and password params.
Yeah,
So I
Alex,
guess we could create a note.
we would
Sorry,
need
say that
a
again.
strong. Yeah, Alex is right on that. We would need a second strong params where we don't require user, but we would permit username and password. But this actually doesn't protect against SQL injection. So active record is what's protecting us against the SQL injection. So when we actually pass the data to active record is sort of screening those things as far as like, are they trying to set a password of like drop table users or something like that? That's really what we mean by SQL injection. But that's
So
not like strong params won't help us with that.
So there'd be no material benefit for doing that in this case?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
So isn't there, I can't remember the name of it. Isn't it more for like when I'm thinking about authorization and I'm thinking about, I think it's called like something escalation, where like someone could try to
privilege escalation.
Yeah, like strong params would help with that, right? So like someone.
So for example, when we do the user create, yeah. So if in user create, if you scroll up to where you were doing the create in the in user controller, so if inside here, if part of the user create, if there was like a role, and we'll talk about this a little bit in tomorrow's class around authorization. If we had a role where we set every user by default to like a regular user, but if we didn't, and we were, like a user that knew how our app worked, and they knew that we had like this user.role, they could maybe inject that into the form data that gets sent to say, I want to set my role to be admin or something like that. And now because we're just doing user.create on line 9 here, it'll just create it as is with the data that came in through the strong params. And so that's where the strong params would say, but we're only allowing email and password. We're not allowing a role or something like that to be in there instead. And so, yeah, it protects us against the privilege escalation type of thing.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So I think long story short, if we want to do, we could do login params here where we're permitting email and password, and then that would just be I think I'd still need to do, what does this creates a hash, right?
Yeah, that'll still create a hash. And so we would still access, no, we would still access it with the
original param. I was thinking just this.
Yeah, you would just do login. Well, you do login params. You'd still access it as a hash. So just like you had params login or params email before, it would just be login params. Yeah. And then login params password. And
it doesn't actually save us anything at that point.
Right. Yeah, so, in this case for logging in, there's no benefit to using strong params for a login. We really only want it when we're creating something so that we're not escalating something that we shouldn't. Another good example, if in little Etsy shop, for example, if you were creating an item and you had an active flag for whether that item was immediately, usable on your site, you might not want a user to automatically turn that flag on as part of the creation. And so you would specifically not allow that to come through the strong params, so that an admin user or something has to come in and like enable that flag to say this item is now for sale. And we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow.
Cool. All right, Chris, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question. If we had some sort of like user could update its parameters, like its email or password, would we want to use strong params in that case too?
I honestly think so, because it's the same kind of as a create. So if the user wanted to update their role, to be admin instead of, just like the basic user, I think they could still do that through an update form. And so I think it would still be a good idea to use strong params there as well. Yep. Okay, I'm going to keep going because we have one more thing to talk about before I let you go off on your own to try this. I would say, okay, so we're here. We're at the point where we're able to log in, and we need to finish our test though. So if we come back to our test, if you remember on our happy path, we had a bunch of this commented out. I'm going to get rid of some of this, this stuff because it's just getting on my nerves. So, okay, so we have this idea of now that we're logged in, we don't want to see all of the same stuff that we saw when we weren't logged in. So we don't want to see, I already have an account. We don't want to see register as a user, but now we do want to see a log out button. So when I do that, right now what happens is I go through this whole flow, I log in, I'm redirected to the root path. And when I go back to our root page, I still see a couple links. And those should actually go away. So I'll run my test and it's going to fail. And again, I'm just going to run that one test right now. Okay, so we expected not to find the link. I already have an account, but we found it. Okay, so that's going to be our first error. And so the question is, how do we go about hiding these? And so now I want to jump over and think about this new concept and this new idea of remembering who the users are that have logged in. So somehow we need to persist that information from, you know, as we're traversing through the application. And if you think about what's happening when you move from page to page, in order to load a new page, what do you need to do behind the scenes? Does anybody know what I'm getting at? It's a type of request. And I don't care about the specific, you know, type of request. I just want to know like the general umbrella that those requests fall in. What are we making when we, you know, view a web page, Ben?
I think it should be an HTTP request. Is that what
Yeah,
you're looking for?
yes, that is it. Yep. And so when we make, you know, when we load the root path or the root page or the welcome page, right? We make an and I shouldn't say right, it's not right. But when we do load that page, we make an HTTP request to the server, to our Rails application, to get all of the information for the page. And then when we go, say we want to go to a profile page, we have to make a new request to get all of the information to the profile page. One thing that we should know about HTTP is this idea that it is stateless. So it does not have the ability to hold state from request to request. So somehow we need to hold that state within our application. And Rails does this by using what we call a session. So I'm going to come over here and let's talk about what a session is. So a session is a way, it's a way to store information about a user. What am I trying to say? So during one request, that is accessible during later requests. Okay, so we store information about a user, and this is the idea of like a user has logged in. They made an HTTP request to, you know, post that information from the form into the database. They get redirected to a new page, which makes a new HTTP request. And somehow we need to figure out that that user has already logged in and their information should persist within the application. So we do that by, we store, we'll say Rails allows us to store information in a session. And a session can be thought of as a hash. We are going to use a session as a hash. So it's just this hash that has keys and values that we can store information about the user. And now Rails is actually doing something, and it's going to take that hash and it's going to actually store it in a cookie, which is going to get stored in the browser on the client side. But we're going to talk about that a little more tomorrow. Ian will walk you through what a cookie is and a little bit more about how that's working. But for right now, all you need to know is that we have a session hash available to us. And it's a way that we can persist data about a user from request to request. Okay. And I'll say it is a hash. And now I'm talking about like the data structure hash, right? Not to be confused with Bcrypt, you know, like hashing of a password that we have access to in the controller. Okay, so when I think about, I want to also enter in this idea of a current user. And so a current user is someone who has logged into our application. And now when we want to pull up their information, we're just going to access them by this current user method. And so I'm going to dream drive this a little bit. And I'm going to say, if we have a current user, then let me get my end here. If we have a current user, then I want to display the logout button. Else, I want to display the register as user and I already have an account, meaning that we don't have a current user and this person who's visiting our site has not logged in yet. So here I'm going to do the log link to log out. And I'm not going to add my path helper here or my path yet because I want to get to that a little bit later. We want to write a test specifically for that. Okay, so this is the flow. If I have a current user, then I want to see a log out link and I want these other links to go away. If I don't want to see log out and I want to see these other links. And that's basically what we wrote in our test. Going back to our test here, just to revise that. So I'm going to run it and we're going to see what we get. And I think it's going to yell at me because it's going to say, well, what is current user? Okay, so we're going to go here and we're going to define a current user method in our application controller because we want to have access to this current user method everywhere in our application. So here is where we're going to use a little bit of inheritance. Okay, so I'm going to define just an instance method called current user. And here is where I'm going to reach into my session hash and I'm going to look for some data about the user. So I'm going to say session of user ID. So I'm assuming that I have a user ID key in my session hash. And this is how I would access that. And I'm going to try and find user.find by that user ID that I stored in my session hash. And mind you, we haven't stored anything yet in the hash, but this is how I would access it if I had stored it. So in my current user, I'm going to find the user by the session ID. And then one thing we need to note is we need to define a helper method. like this, so that this method now is available in all of our controllers. So make sure you actually define it as a helper method. Now I'm going to run my test. And it's going to say, okay, cool. I can't find a user without an ID. So now we have to figure out how to get the user ID into the session hash so that we can retrieve it to check if we have a logged in user. And this is going to happen in a few different places. Excuse me. This is going to happen in our registration flow. So let me just go into my Rails console and show you what it looks like. I'm going to create a user. So we can do this in the development console. Alex and password. And I need that to be a string. Okay, so I'm creating a user, great. And I'm going to exit and I'm gonna run my Rails server. And then I'm gonna go over into localhost. Okay, so let me actually comment this out for just a second. Where am I? Okay, here. We'll come back to that in just a second. I just want to show you where we're at here. And I'm going to get rid of all this for 2 seconds. Okay. All right. Now we're going to redo this. Okay. So I'm a new user. I come to the site. I see register as a user, which I already did. I have a user in the database. I just did it through the console. And now I'm going to click, okay, I already have an account, and I'm going to do alex@email.com. Or did I do example.com? Example. And then I'm going to put in my password. Notice we have a password field here. And when I log in with the right stuff, it's going to work. But clearly I didn't use the right credentials. So I did alex@email. Okay, let's try this one more time. We know our sad path works, which is great. And this is password, and I'm gonna log in. Okay, so now I see welcome alex@email.com, and then I see these links again, and I don't want to see those, okay? And so the other thing, okay, thank you. The other thing that we want to see as well is that for the registration flow, I can register. I'll say another at email.com and then do like a password. This should also be a password field, incidentally. And then now I'm here, but I'm required to log in after I register. Like it didn't get me anywhere. And so I don't want to like have to log in after I register either. So it should happen in the registration, and it should also happen in our login where we're storing the user data in our session. So I'm going to come back to my user controller. And I'm going to take a look at here, create, and then I'm also going to take a look at this login action. And to get us kicked off, I'm going to pull in a new user story. And at this point, just so you can go back and look at this, I'm jumping over to the second authentication link that was in the Google Doc. And I'm going to jump down to the section called Remembering Our Users. Okay. Remembering users. So I'm going to grab the test from there. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that for proceed. And I'm going to start with our registration spec actually. And it creates a new user, and then I'm going to add this test that says it keeps a user logged in after registering. And so I've got to change a couple things. We can keep all of that the same. And if you remember, we already changed our form, so I'm going to make sure we have the right information here because we're using form with. And we've got password, and then click on register. And now we're going to go to a profile page at this point, and we're going to expect when we route to that new profile page that we see the information there, and it'll say hello email. Okay. So let's run this test and see if we can make sure our user data persists. Come on, here we go. And I'm running the test starting on line 20 specifically. Okay, cool. So can't find a button register as a user. I think I just capitalized it up here. Okay. So cool. So no route matches profile, because here we're now, after we fill in the form, we are going to route ourselves to the profile page. And just wanted to clarify something I noticed in the chat. We didn't actually have a password field in the registration form. We had a password field in the login form, but not the registration. So if I come over to the new user form, here's where we'd want to change that to a password field. And now the user, you won't be able to see, you'll get the dots when you're typing in the password. Okay, so we're at the point where we have a no route matches profile. I want to take a quick pause because I realize it's been a while since we had our last. So I'll stop there. Let's come back at 11:10 and we'll keep going. Okay. All right, it's 11:10. We'll go ahead and get started again. Okay, we left off at the point where we don't have a route called profile, so we're going to create that. And we're going to come to our routes file, and we're going to, again, here, create a route called profile, and then we're going to send that to our users show. Okay. Just like that. Now I'm going to run the test again. And now we don't have a show action in our users controller, so I'm going to go ahead and add that here. I like to just put those at the top. Shoot. Okay. And then I think it's going to tell me I don't have a template. There we go. Or a view. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add that show.html.arb. Okay, and here's where I want to see that text that says hello user. Say hello. Oh, come on. Okay. And now I'm going to access this idea of the current user because now I am logged in. So I want to say hello current user dot email. Okay. So when I run my test, I get back to this. What is a current user? So I'm going to go back to my application controller and uncomment out all the things that we just did, where I have this current user and I'm going to find it by the user ID that we stored in our session. And now I'm going to do that. And if you remember, we didn't actually store a user ID in our session. So it's going to say I can't find a user without an ID. And so now I'm going to go back to my users controller. And in my create, I'm going to actually store the user ID in the session. And this is how I do that. I say session of user ID equals user.id. Okay, and to make this a little less confusing, I'm going to change that because we have a user up here already in the user params. And that's it. So I automatically have the session hashed, and I'm going to say I'm going to store a new key in the session called user ID, and I'm going to set it equal to this value. Doug, I saw your hand up.
I think I kind of answered my own question, but I'll ask it anyway. Is there any value to storing the entire user instead of just the ID, or any time that you'd want to do one over the other?
Potentially, you know, like if you want to be able to say you had like a name and you say you had different information, I think you could maybe store specific attributes in the session. One thing that you want to keep in mind is there is a limit to the amount of data that you can store in the session because it's actually being stored in the browser. And so you probably don't want to store data that you're not going to need in that session. So, yeah. All right. Any other questions about this line?
Alex, you also need to change your flash message on line 15.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay. Cool. All right. I'm going to run this test. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, I'm missing a comma. We'll go back to my show. And now it should work. Cool. We have successfully stored and persisted information about our user across HTTP requests. And that is the idea of the user ID. So now when we go back to our login spec, we need to finish out this test where we don't want to have the links. And if we come back to our index, remember how we had our if statement here looking for the current user. I'm going to just add that back in. And now we're going to say if there's a current user, meaning that someone has already logged in, they're going to see a log out link. And then if not, they're going to see register. And I'm going to run this test. User login, I think is what it's called. I'll run these tests and see if those pass. Okay. And I'm getting the error, couldn't find user without an ID. And what do we need to do here to fix this? So we fixed it on the registration, but we didn't fix it on the login. And what is that? And I'll just come here in our test. Oh, sorry, I want it to go to the controller. So this is our registration, like create controller. We did this here, but in the login, what are we not doing? Oh, Andrew, sorry, I didn't see your hand raised.
No, you're okay. We have to create a session when they log in as well, not just when they register.
Yeah, that's right. So here, after they've been authenticated, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say session of user ID equals user.id. And keep in mind, like I could name this whatever I wanted. I could say Alex is the best.
You could also set the flash message to just use current user.email.
You could, for sure. But then you'd have to do another user.find in order to get that information instead of using the object that you already have access to here. So you want to like just kind of keep in mind that you're not doing unnecessary database lookups. And that could be the same, you know, the same thing could be true for our profile view of like, since we're coming to our profile after logging in, we have access to that user object still, we could probably use that user object instead of current user. Or let me just change this back to user ID. We can do this in our application controller. Bam. Who remembers about memoization? Anyone? So this line is saying, if I already have looked at the user and created a user object, then I'm going to store it in this instance variable. However, if this instance variable is empty, then I'm going to actually do the database lookup to find the user. So it's probably good to memoize this, because then we can use the current user method all over the place in our controllers and our views, and it's going to reuse that same object rather than create a new object. So yeah, so I'm going to run our test just to make sure that this actually passes. Okay, what's the problem? Action view couldn't find a user without an ID. Okay, so what I think is happening here is that when we first go to the page, to our root path, we're checking right away if there's a current user, and we're not logged in at that point, and so there isn't going to be a current user, and it's going to try to do the user.find with the session ID, but the session ID is going to be empty. So here we need to say if how do we want to do this? My mind is blanking. Somehow we need to check first that there's a session with a user ID in it, and then check the current user. Doug.
Could you just say if session user ID and current user? Would that, because if the session ID is empty, it'll return nil.
Yeah, I think that is right. And I think we want to do that in our application controller. Yeah. So here, when it calls this method, we're going to use the current user if it's there. If not, we're going to look it up, but only if there's a session of user ID. Otherwise, we're not going to do anything. So let me see if this solves our problems. So yes, that was great. Thank you, Doug. Okay. Did I not spell that correctly? Couldn't find link log out. I'm here. And that's because we're not displaying it. All right, so I think that should get our test passing. Woohoo, we did it. Okay. Let me go back. Did I see another hand raised before we go look at this in our development environment? And it's always helpful just to like go through the flow so you can see it. Okay, so we're brand new. I'm going to register. I'm going to say Alex. Let's use somebody else. Let's use Ian. @email.com, and Riker is your password. Cool. Okay, awesome, it worked. And now we can log out. Let's see. The logout's not going to work because I didn't put a pass helper there. So it's not going to do anything. And so I think the challenge that I have for you all is, if I was going to log out, what would I need to do in order to log out? And I'll go back to my user controller. Love it, Ian. What would I do to log out of my user's controller? I'm sorry, of the application. Qua, what do you think?
I think we have to somehow destroy the session user ID.
Yeah, that's it. So you could think of saying like having like a log out method, and I'm just gonna do this kind of pseudocode-y, but somehow you would need to do like session of user ID, and then maybe just like set it equal to nil. And then the whole, this idea of having a user goes away because we don't have any information in the session about that user. Jake.
Should we just look back in the session controller again? It's still that one like empty method in there in the session controller.
In the session controller?
Yeah, I just want to, like, we were moving really fast. I think I might have missed something.
Oh, we don't have a session controller at this point. Was it in the application controller?
Maybe. I'm trying to follow along with like the lesson plan.
So the lesson plan does do it a little bit differently. So I've been walking through, so it's not going to be a straight comparison between what I did and the lesson plan.
Okay.
So
All right. Never mind then.
Okay. Cool. All right, Genevieve, did you have a question?
Yeah. So sessions in general, I mean, based upon the way that we built it, does this mean that it'll just persist forever? Is there, or does it like delete itself after a certain amount of time? Like, how would you log out a user after a defined period? Because I'm sure you wouldn't want them logged in forever, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're gonna make you wait 21.5 hours before I tell you the answer to that one. So we'll cover that in class tomorrow.
Got it.
The short version is session cookies go away when you close your browser. So if you close your browser, it'll automatically log you out as well.
All right, Kyle, question.
And so the if the session was holding any other data other than the user ID, when we set the user ID to nil, does that also kind of like delete all of that data that was persistent before?
No, so the data would still be there. However, we wouldn't, our application is only relying on the user ID in order to look up the user so that we know who that person is. And so in essence, the behavior of the application would be such that there is no logged in user, but the data would actually still be in the session until you close your browser.
And then my other question is, do sessions always exist? And it's just sort of, it's only whether they have a user ID that sort of changes? Yeah,
so the session is still there. And it's just a matter of if you're putting information or data into that session. And it's stored as a cookie in the browser. And so Ian will talk more about that tomorrow. But yes, it is, that session hash is always there for you to access. All right, Andrew, question.
Yeah, I was going along with you, and it's in my show page. It's not liking where I call like current user dot email. It's giving me nil class for current user, and I wasn't sure why.
Yeah, so I think you have this helper method defined in your application controller.
Yeah,
you do. And in your show page,
I have hello and then in ERB tags current user dot name. I added a name for everything, so.
Okay.
for the user as well.
Yeah, I would say like check your controller to make sure that you are where did we do that? Hold on. We might have, let me just like run all the tests real fast to make sure we got all of our loose ends. Okay, we did. So what test were you looking for? What were you running?
I was only running that last test we did, like keeps the user logged in after registering. And I'm assuming expect a page to have that content of hello name because it gets to profile, like the new page,
Gotcha.
and it doesn't know what current user is. So I tried defining it in my show method in my user's controller.
Let's we're gonna break off and have y'all like work on this on your own. So I'll circle back and take a look at your code with you in a little bit. Is that okay?
Thanks.
Sure. All right, I'll take a couple more questions. Ben, I see your hand raised.
This might not be like the time to ask this, and maybe it belongs in a DM. But I remember Ian, you giving a talk a while ago about I can't remember what it was exactly, but it was some sort of like stateless login or like passwordless login. And was that like avoiding the need for a session, or what was the idea behind that?
No, it still used a session, but what it was is instead of asking you for a password, it just asked you for an email address. And when you put in your email address, it would submit to the controller here, and then the controller would just send an email with a link, and that it was a specially crafted link that when you clicked on that, it would associate kind of a passphrase, like a plain text sort of string with your user model entry to say, like, you know, Ben's entry is like ABC123. And so I'm going to send you a link with that ABC123 string. So when you click on that link, it'll look up that ABC123 and go, oh, that's Ben. Let me log that person in as Ben. And then it destroys that code in the table right away. So no one else can use that link. So it's a one-time use. And so it's a way of avoiding having to have a user enter a password or even store a password in the system. So when they register, all they have to register with is an email address. And it relies on you being able to log into Google and check your email. Now, if someone can hack your email, you've got bigger problems than whether you could get into that D&D site that we built.
Cool. Okay, let's take one more question, and then I want to give y'all an opportunity to try this on your own. So Kyle.
Sorry, that's still up from before.
Oh, is it? Okay. All right, cool. All right, so at this point, we've registered and we've logged in a user and we've persisted that user with the help of our current user helper method. And so what I'd like y'all to do is actually try to run through as much of this as you can. You only have a half an hour, so you're most likely not going to get through this. And try to just go back through this flow. And I think what I like this because I want you to try to do it just using the lesson plans, which and not having access to this video or to my code yet. And then later on, I'll push up my code and get the video on YouTube so that you can refer back to it when you are trying to implement this in your projects. So spend the next half an hour, make sure you take a palm break if you need it, and work on this on your own individually. So go ahead and clone down the repo that I posted in the Slack channel earlier today if you have not done so, and try to implement both user registration and login. I will be in this, you can stay on the Zoom call. Actually, I'd prefer that you just stay on the Zoom call, turn off your video, and then if you've got questions, feel free to just ask them. And we will kind of wrap this all up at 11:55 and then get going. All right.
You're muted.
Thank you. I said a whole lot of really great things that y'all just missed. What I was saying is if it's distracting to have people talking in the background, feel free to leave the call. Just join again at 11:55. And Andrew, we can pull up your code now and kind of debug that error that you're getting.
Cool, thank you.
Yep, I'll stop sharing.
So this is what I was getting, the current user.
Okay.
Yeah, undefined method name for nil class. I have current user here defined. And I have my helper method here.
Okay.
And then in my show, I just called current user.name.
Okay.
And then my test, it's failing here when it just goes to visit the profile and it tries to hit that current user.
Hmm. Can I see your user's controller?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I don't know if this will solve the error, but I would move what you have on line 15. I would move that into the new user.save block under, yeah. Just make sure you're not, until you know that the user is actually being saved, don't save that. Okay, so I don't know. Let's put a pry in.
Is this happening when you're registering a user or when you're logging in? For
This is
both?
for the register. This is the only one I'm testing right now.
Keeps the user logged in. Hold on, let me take a look and see if I notice anything that's different from mine. I wonder, okay, try this. Change the new user from an instance variable to just a regular variable on line 15, not there.
Sorry.
That as an instance on line 15, and then 16 and also everywhere. Line 16, 17, and then you have it on 21 as well.
Thank you.
Can you rerun the test? I don't know if that would make a difference. No, okay. And I'm glad it didn't, because then I would be a little bit more confused. But okay.
Can we put a pry in your current user method?
Yeah.
Up top or below?
Yeah, up top. So let's look at session in here. Look at session user ID. So it doesn't think that you have a session user ID, so it's not loading a user. So if you exit from here, this might be hitting a different test. So this is generally where you want to isolate that test and grab like just right at the very top line of your terminal, grab that RSpec line, including 61, so that you run just that test.
I have all the other ones skipped with that.
Well, but it wasn't skipped because when you typed exit there, it went back into that pry. So you've got at least one other test hitting that. So let's isolate just that one test and run just that one test. So not using skip, but like,
yeah, so go to, you have users.
Oh, yeah.
if you scroll up, you'll see that RSpec line. You can just grab it from there. No, in your terminal. A little more. A little more. A little more. You'll see it in red right there. So grab that RSpec line in red. Yeah.
Oh, well done.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Cool. So now it's going to isolate just that one test. Now let's look at session user ID. So that's still nil. So let's go back and look at your test on line 61. So you're visiting, you're clicking register, you're filling in your details, you're clicking on register. From here, I mean, typically this registration would be redirecting them, so you may not even need line 72, but that shouldn't matter.
Yeah, that was, I think I copied that over from the
right.
lesson.
We're not doing that in the controller.
Yeah.
So you have to manually do that. Yeah.
So then when we visit that, go ahead.
I think there's an application control. I don't know if you have that or statement in your current user.
Oh, yeah.
It's just the equal.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's no.
Well, without the memoization, it just means every time we call current user, it's going to go do the database lookup again and again.
Yeah.
Right. The memoization means we just do the database lookup one time and store it. In this case, the session user ID is nil, so it doesn't matter whether we're memoizing it or not. Session user ID isn't set to anything at this point.
Trevor,
so let's put a. Go ahead.
Real fast, Trevor, did you have a suggestion? I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the user's controller, and here for new user on line 14, you're using a user.create. If you change that to a user.new, would that implement the if new user.save as a Boolean rather than create? And that might be the issue.
Technically, create does a create and a save. Create does a new and a save together. So calling new user.save again actually is just checking like, did that actually save okay? It doesn't actually try to save a second time. So I don't think that's the problem. What I would probably do, let's put a pry after line 16. So after we set the new user ID into the session, let's look at session at that point and make sure that it actually wrote in there. No, leave that one and leave that other one in. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting too. We're hitting that pry a second time. Right, because the first time
is when I click submit and then when I visit it again.
Yeah, so in your pry session now, let's look at session user ID, because I think that second trip is where we're checking that you're actually logged in. No, it's still no. Yeah. Okay, so let's exit from here. So type exit from here, and then we should hit the pry for, we're not hitting the pry for the actual user create. Type exit here. So we're never getting into that user create. So there's your problem. We're never setting that session ID. So when we click on the register, when we click on register, do we know that we're clicking on the button to actually register as a user? On line 70, I might make that like a click button instead of a click on, because if you've got a link on the top of the page that says register as a new user, it might be clicking on that link over and over again. And so you're not actually logging in, or you're not actually registering the user, because we're not hitting that block of code.
Yeah.
So type exit from here. No, it's still not hitting that block of code. So take me to the form where you're building your user, like your user registration form. So you did call it register. And we know that we're clicking that as a button now. Okay. So we need to put a pry earlier in your create method, because for some reason we're not getting into that save block. So let's put a pry after line 14. Yeah. Just make sure that we're getting there. So type exit. So there we're in there. So let's look at new user. And that did not give us a user ID. So my guess is if you put a bang after the create on line 14, we're going to see a database error as to why that didn't get created in the database. So type exit from here. I'm guessing there's some kind of validation that's failing. So run that test again. And type exit. And now we should see a database error. So your name field can't be blank. So in the test where you're registering your user, your name is blank. Or it's not seeing that. It should be user underscore name. There you go. Yep.
That's a deep sigh.
All right. So now if we type exit, so now from here, if we look at new user, we should see an ID show up. Yep. So we see an ID field there now. So now if we type exit, it should then hit current user in our pry there. And now if we look at session user ID, we should see our user ID of 73 in there. There we go. So if you type exit from here, your test should pass. Yep. There you go.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Thank you so much. Little mistakes cause big issues.
I love debugging. I love diving in on that kind of stuff, trying to figure out why isn't this stuff working.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Thank you guys so much. Or thank y'all so much.
Yeah. Hey Jake, did you bundle? Cannot load such files. Should have flash matchers. Can you maybe show where you have that should have matchers config in your Rails helper? If you wouldn't mind.
Sorry, were you talking to me? I had my headphones off.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was talking to you, Jake.
Yeah.
Would you mind just sharing where you have that config?
Yeah. So I'm over here, and I've just got my spec set up, features, users, users registration form. This is a folder in here.
Cool. Okay, so you're in your Rails. Go to your Rails helper.
Yep.
And then go to the. Where did you? Okay, you've got it there.
I added it up here too, in case it wanted it up there.
Get rid of that there. Yeah, were you going to say something, Ian?
Oh no, I was going to say it can't load that file, so that require was broken. That's what it was complaining about.
Yeah.
Now you need to create your database. So you need to do a Railsdb create.
Railsdb create?
Or Rails
or
also
Rails
would work.
Yeah.
Either one works. Yep.
Cool.
Oh, that's what I was saying here. The AR no database error.
Yep.
Okay, now I'm on the error actually one.
That looks like progress. Great.
Yeah. Right. the right error is always nice.
I think the shoulda matchers documentation is wrong because it definitely tells you to put it in the spec helper. But that doesn't work.
I always get it mixed up because one of the files calls the other, and I forget if at the top of our test we require in the Rails helper, but I don't think Rails helper requires in spec helper. But I think if you run our spec, it
does
load in the spec helper, which then loads in the Rails helper.
No, the Rails helper loads in the spec helper.
It does? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I see. I always get that one mixed up. I've been doing Rails for years, and I still get that one mixed up. So.
Yeah.
I just tend to put everything in Rails helper. I don't put anything in spec helper anymore.
Yeah, I think it seems to be the way to go. Because yeah, but I still don't understand why, even if you put the shoulda matcher config in the spec helper, since it is loaded in the Rails helper, why it doesn't work. But
I don't know if it's a scope issue or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I remember when I cloned this down, the shoulda matchers was in the spec helper. I had to move it over.
You did, yeah. Yeah, we did that at the very beginning of class.
Mechanics of the secure password has secure password and that stuff. So we add like this has secure password to a model, but at some point, like we've got a form that's taking in this field that's a password, and it's like passing it to the model, which is called password, but then Bcrypt is like comes in at some point, changes things to actually saving to the database the password digest. So can you like walk me through the mechanics of that, at least to some high level? I'm interested in knowing like at what point these things get from password to password digest, and then if we use the password confirmation, how that would work. Maybe too general of a, or I don't know. I feel like it would help me understand how to use this stuff if I actually knew kind of what's going on.
So yeah, I don't know that I can answer that question in much detail. I don't know if Ian, you could, but I did put a link in the chat to the documentation for has secure password. And so that has some additional information in terms of like just like the Rails documentation.
Yeah. So what Bcrypt will do is if you give it a password field and a password confirmation field, it'll double check that those match. You'll also want to build a validation that if you expect there to be a password confirmation, that the user's actually given it to you. So in your controller, for example, you'll want to add password confirmation as a strong param. But before you even do the user.save, you want to make sure that the confirmation is actually present in params and not blank and so on. And then the has secure password, what's basically going to happen there is Bcrypt looks at that flag, and then it looks at password, and then it says, okay, well, I've been given a field called password, but in the database, I'm going to store it as password digest. And so it's looking at the names of the field to then determine that it has to do this digest, which is this one-way hashing, in order to like do that one-way encryption or encoding. I guess it's not technically encryption. And then storing it in that digest field instead. And so Bcrypt's magic is going from password to password digest. That's kind of its job. as part of that, and it's doing this really strong math formula in between.
So Bcrypt is like having this, making our model have this sort of alias. Well, I guess it's not really an alias. Are we ever referencing password in any other place? I guess login and register.
You can within a test. So if you do like a user.create in a test and you have email, set to Alex at example and password set to baby fox or something like that. Just trying to think of like the baby foxes that lived in Alex's backyard for a little while. Then when you fill in the form, you can say fill in with user.email and fill in with user.password, and it'll actually grab like baby fox or whatever and like put it in the password field. But generally we never use user.password anywhere else, because when we're telling the model to save, it's then kicking it over to Bcrypt, and Bcrypt is going, okay, cool, I've got a password now in kind of this pseudo model, but I'm actually going to run it through the hashing method to do the digest, and I'm going to store it as the digest at that point.
I didn't realize that you could even refer to user.password in the test. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's super handy. That way you don't have to retype everything.
Yeah.
But when you do like user.create or whatever in the test, it's still technically a model, and but you still have access to user.password as the plain text that you've put in there. But that's really the only place that we would actually use it in our app. We would never use that plain text password anywhere else in our application because it would be really insecure.
So like whenever you recall, or if you go and find user.find whatever, what is that password attribute going to be on the model? If I just user.find somebody new and then I call user.password.
So it won't actually be user.password, because user.password actually doesn't exist when you do the lookup on the user model. It only has access to password digest.
Okay, so that's actually returning us it's turning us more of the database, something that matches to the database. So it would have the password digest field. Right. The password. So I need to think about that less as an attribute that's kind of there, I suppose, and more of.
So it's only there when we're writing into the database. So think of it that way. So when we're taking a user password and we're storing it in the database, we have access to that plain text password. But when we do a user find, we only get back the digest. We never get back the plain text version because there is no way to turn that back into plain text.
Yeah.
So whenever we're looking it up, we only have the digest. When we're saving it, because we've been given a password, we still have that plain text password that we can reference.
So it's almost like an attribute on the user object that's being created that doesn't actually get saved. So then when we retrieve that user, it's gone. Like that plain text password is not there anymore.
That's correct.
Does it have any relation to the what's the flag for, like, is this a new model or has it been saved? Like there's a way to.
So you're saying like when you create a new user object and you haven't saved it yet?
Yeah, the new record bin. I think like does it have, is it kind of like if it is a new record, we have this password, whatever it is, Bcrypt password thing. And then as soon as it's saved, that may not even be correct. I don't know if it is true that as soon as it is saved, we don't have the password. But if we just had like found it from the database, if we just pulled this model from the database, we wouldn't have the password thing.
Don't have it for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about. I haven't seen anywhere where it goes into too much detail about how that's actually working under the hood, but yeah, I really like kind of thinking through like how would the mechanics of this actually work. But it is 11:56, so I just want to wrap up, and I see we've got folks who have joined back. So I think overall, I'm hoping that this gave you enough of an idea of the flow of authentication, also, and the different pieces of authentication being like this idea of registering a user, and then the idea of logging in a user with those credentials, how to store those credentials in the database, and then also how to persist that user within your application once they are logged in by storing information in the session. Tomorrow, as we mentioned, we'll go into a little bit more detail about sessions and about cookies. And Ian will walk us through that. One other thing that I do want to mention that we did not go through in class, but I would like y'all to explore this on your own, is a way to potentially make your login routes a little bit more RESTful. And so if I come back to this real fast, and I come over, I'm just going to look at my routes file. So right now, I showed you how to create login paths, and we created non-standard Rails actions in our users controller. But now that we have this idea of a session, another alternative would be to do something like this: get login, and then create a new controller called a sessions controller, where we can use more of the standard Rails actions. So you do a get to a sessions new, and then you'd also do a post to a sessions create. And then therefore you could do a delete to a sessions destroy.
Probably do that as log
Sorry,
out.
log out. Yeah, I just saw that as you're saying that. Something like that, right? So this way, if you, oh, go ahead, Ian.
Sorry, real quick. In a browser though, a browser typically can't, like if you make a link called logout, the browser typically can't send a destroy action. So I would copy line 13 to also be a get that goes to the same session destroy, but make that a get verb instead. So that way you have both a get and delete going to the destroy. So that way you can make a link that you can click on that will actually log you out.
Log you out. Okay. Cool. But yeah, so this is, I just wanted to show you that. And then I think the implication of this is that we would take all of the information from these actions that we created in the user and move those over to this new controller. But just wanted to put some food for thought. What if we were to make a new controller instead of using non-standard actions? So explore that as you implement this in your project. And I think this is the type of thing that just takes iteration. So you've just got to do it a few times before you really get the flow down. But yeah, I hope that you are all able to go forth and authenticate your users in your applications. And cool, I think this afternoon we've got some project work time. We will be around. If you've got questions, feel free to DM us or just mention us in your project channels. And we will see you all tomorrow.
Quick note, if anybody's interested in doing SLC, Ellen Mary mentioned to us that we're still looking for an SLC rep for your cohort. So if you could let us know or let Ellen Mary know, that would be super helpful. Thank you.
Hey, Ian, I had a quick question for you. If so, I saw in a video that you were creating a folder and a file in the same thing in VS Code. How did you accomplish that?
In both VS Code and Atom, if you tell it that you just want to create a new file, you type in the path / file name, and it'll, if the path doesn't exist, it'll create the path at the same time.
Ah, cool. All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, thanks everyone.